Well, welcome to another dose of science. And this week it is our Halloween special. Gonna tell you all kinds of interesting stories about Halloween. And I'm joined by our whole crew today. We have Jonathan and Gaia and Ada. And we're gonna tell you some interesting stories about Halloween. Where to start? At the beginning with the history. So we're going to go to Gaia, who's going to tell us all about where Halloween comes from.
All right. So, the history of Halloween. Halloween dates back to the ancient pagan Celtic harvest festival called Samhain. It was held in Western and Central Europe during the Iron Age. And, And it means summer's end in Old Irish. It happened every October 31st, and it was kind of like their New Year's Eve, since it was when the Celtic year ended. This was a time when the world of the dead supposedly became accessible to humans, and gods would play tricks on the mortals. People sacrificed animals to appease the spirits and lit bonfires to protect their families from fairies and witches who were said to try to entice the living to join the land of the dead. People also may have worn costumes, probably animal skins, to confuse the spirits and avoid being possessed. Samhain was revived by Wiccans, or modern-day witches, as a harvest festival in the late 20th century. So rather than trying to suppress pagan activities like Samhain, in the 9th century, the Catholic Church proposed turning the festival into a day to honor their saints and their dead, and they called it All Saints' Day. On this day, people feasted, and children would go door to door singing for the dead, and in exchange, they would receive soul cakes. This was a precursor to trick-or-treating. Then came All Hallows' Eve, which was the night before All Saints' Day. It was an evening the Christians celebrated when they turned Samhain's rituals into spooky fun. In the 1800s, Irish immigrants brought the tradition to North America. One European Halloween tradition included carving vegetables like turnips, potatoes, and pumpkins, and turning them into lanterns to ward away evil spirits. But how did we get the name jack-o'-lantern? Decaying plant material, or peat, in bogs sometimes releases gases that ignite when in contact with oxygen, and they appear as a blue light at night. And some called these mysterious-looking lights jack-o'-lanterns since they looked like spooky lanterns to travelers. The name is also associated with the Irish legend of Stingy Jack, a drunk who bargains with the devil and ends up roaming around with only a hollowed-out turnip to light his way. Irish immigrants brought the Halloween tradition of carving jack-o'-lanterns to North America, and they used pumpkins because they natively grew here. Costumes likely came about from the Irish and Scottish practice of mumming and guising, where people would disguise themselves and go door to door asking for food.
Those are some very, very scary costumes.
I know.
Disturbingly so.
Yes, definitely. Dressing up was thought to be a way for people to poke fun at Satan. So you had to be pretty scary, I guess. Guising in North America was first recorded in a Kingston, Ontario newspaper in 1911, but it took until about the 1930s to really gain popularity throughout North America. Tricks started as early as during the time of Samhain, but the pranks that happened during the Harvest Festival were usually blamed on the fairies. Some historians believe trick-or-treating evolved from a European tradition where people impersonated the spirits or souls of the dead and received offerings on their behalf. By the late 1800s, the tradition of playing tricks on Halloween became pretty common. And in North America, pranks included tipping over outhouses, opening farmers' gates, and egging houses, which of course still happens today. So by the mid-20th century, towns wanted to discourage such pranks and rebranded Halloween as a more community-based family event, which is closer to the Halloween we know and love today. During Samhain, it was common to leave food out as an offering to the dead. And that continued when Halloween replaced Samhain, and people would dress up and go door to door praying for the dead. In exchange, they would receive cakes and other treats. By the 1950s, candy was becoming more affordable. And so that kind of replaced the cakes and treats. And it also became a way to bribe kids to keep them from pulling pranks on their neighbors. So as you can see, these are some popular candies that we still know and love today, the Hershey bars, Cracker Jacks, and love it or hate it, candy corn, or chicken feed, as it was once known, has been around a long time, so it's probably not going anywhere. And one last scary thought, just how many extra calories will you be consuming as you dig into that Halloween candy? A fun-sized package of peanut M&Ms seems like a lot of calories, but at least the peanuts give you some nutrition. Or you could just stick to the relatively low-calorie candy that's basically just sugar, nerds. In any case, what are you all going to go guising as this Halloween?
Very good, very interesting. And an obvious connection to candies, which Ada is going to regale us with.
Yeah, I'm much more interested in the candy side of Halloween than the costume side. I find as a grad student, I don't exactly have time to go to a party or trick-or-treating. I'm actually even volunteering at the cat shelter I work at this Saturday, so I won't even be able to do something if I did find something to do. But nonetheless, I'm really interested in a specific aspect about candy at Halloween, which is the idea that people will have poisoned candy or razor blades in your candy, or generally that someone is trying to harm you or your children through giving them Halloween treats. And you can this entire idea can be wrapped up under the term Halloween sadism. And so you've probably seen a lot of news reports about this, things like razor blades in candy bars, needles, rat poison, THC-laced pills found in children's candy. The reports are absolutely extensive, and there's relatively little evidence to support any of them. Dr. Joel Best is a researcher who has been studying Halloween sadism for many, many decades, and he has failed in the modern era to find a single event that is actually proof of Halloween sadism. Specifically, if you count Halloween sadism as coming from a stranger. So there are a couple events of children getting sick from candy given to them in their own home, candy that had been tampered with or contaminated in some way, but never from a stranger, never from random trick-or-treating. So that's what these few, there are a few legitimated claims that I'll talk a bit more about, but most of these on this list that you're seeing here are reported incidents, not confirmed incidents. And by nature of these events and generally how big the world is and how many humans inhabit it, it's hard to confirm these types of things. So one interesting aspect is the idea, because as Gaia was talking about, some of our trick-or-treating traditions came out of giving people sweets, things like cakes and baked goods, and those are just open. You make them by hand and you give them out. And if you think even from my childhood and probably from yours as well, there was this idea of like candy apples being associated with Halloween or bags of popcorn. And by the time I was trick-or-treating, I was under strict orders to never eat anything that was not sealed and had not been inspected by my mother. But it makes you wonder where this idea of like, oh, I get apples for Halloween and just eat them because I trust my neighbors came from. And I can tell you that it started going away during the polio epidemic, because this was right around when individually wrapped and sealed candy became popular, because people were scared they were going to catch polio from trick-or-treating. And so by having these wrapped and sealed, people felt much safer than buying just like loose candy from a candy maker. Because polio is transmitted mostly via feces, unless you had a really, really unhygienic candy maker, you're probably fine. But nonetheless, our candy is sealed now. And so there have been, well, here, I don't want to spoil the lead, so I'll stay here for a second. There have been just a handful of cases. So there was a boy who was once poisoned by his father. However, the media got a hold of it through the guise of he ate a pixie stick, those little like sugar-filled straw things that we pretend are candy, not just literal sugar. It contained poison, but his father prepared it and gave it to him. But That wasn't clear because the boy then went out trick-or-treating, got a bag full of candy, wasn't clear which candy came from where. He died, and it was eventually tracked back that his dad created that pixie stick and had also just taken out a very, very, very large life insurance claim on his son. So you can see how there's a little like smidgen of truth there. You know, a kid did die from eating candy, but the whole truth isn't there. Similarly, there was an elderly woman, and I wish I remembered her name, in the US in the 40s, who to children who she thought were too old to be trick-or-treating, she gave them little paper goodie bags filled with, rather than treats, tricks. And those tricks included boxes of rat poison, mouse traps, steel wool, dog biscuits, kind of just general. She was basically trolling them. She was basically giving them a bag full of garbage to be like, hey, you, no candy for you. You're way too old to be here. But she clearly marked it as such. It wasn't like she took rat pellets and like put them in loose. They were in a box that said rat poison. She never pretended they were anything other than they were. Nonetheless, she was technically prosecuted for intent to injure. I don't believe she ever served any jail time. But again, there's an element of truth. You can see where people maybe, if these claims get inflated over the years, and every year after year after year, there are so many claims of razor blades and needles and everything found in candies, even though none of them wind up substantiated. So you can see where these fears likely come from. And so one way that people have tried to combat these fears is by doing candy x-rays. Last time I took a look for this was in 2019, and I found people, clinics offering to x-ray people's candies, mostly in the US. I didn't actually find any in Canada. I didn't find any for 2020. I don't know if that has more to do with COVID or the general awakening that this is nonsense. I also did not find any for 2021, but until we leave COVID, I cannot draw a conclusion for that. But what's really interesting to me is that it doesn't work. If you look on the right, there are two figures from a study where they specifically inserted needles into apples, into a candy apple, and sent it through one of these programs. And most of the time, the metallic objects weren't detected. So you can see on the top as well, specifically if you get it at the wrong angle, a sewing needle is long, but if you're looking at it from the end, it's just a little dot. You can just see a tiny, tiny, tiny white radiographic dot showing up on the x-ray. So that wouldn't be seen. In the bottom photo, it's a little bit more visible, but even still, if you have a radiograph technician who is looking at like 200 bags of candy over the night and they've never ever seen a sewing needle before, they're going to be looking quickly. They're not going to be giving this the eyes that they would give, say, an actual medical x-ray that they were looking at. So it's really, in practice, these programs, there is no substantiated claim that they have ever actually helped someone avoid ingesting poison or metal or anything of the sort. But they do waste a ton of money and a ton of time. If you were to screen every bag of candy of every child who goes trick-or-treating in the US, it would easily cost tens of millions of dollars. Because these are medical professionals. These are medical professionals who need to be paid a medical professional salary, who are now being taken away from work they need to be doing. And now that we are in a pandemic, it's even more important that they not be taken off of taking radiographs of COVID-19 patients' chests to x-ray some kid's candy when there's very little threat to the child in the first place, and it probably wouldn't detect it even if there was something there. So my evidence-based Halloween tips are: don't bother bleaching your kids' candy. We've already had the discussion many times that fomites ended up not being the great risk of transmission that we thought they were going to, not that we thought they were going to be, that we initially thought they could be. Evidence has shown that the risk of transmission is relatively minor. So you don't need to bother going through and bleaching every single piece. If you're really concerned about it, I would recommend just leaving the candy alone in a room for a few days to naturally, let the viral particles die. So don't bother bleaching your candy. Don't bother going through it and checking for opened or tampered with candy. If you're really concerned, tell your kid not to eat anything that's been opened, but you really do not need to take your time to go through and pick through every single piece. My mom did it every year for like 13 years, and she never found a single one. That is an anecdote, but the evidence backs up my anecdote. You do need to wear a mask, not a Halloween mask, although you can wear that too, but wear the normal mask underneath the Halloween mask, especially because the majority of children are not vaccinated. Although we did see, we're seeing today the FDA potential approval of the Pfizer vaccine for kids, is it 5 to 11, 6 to 11, something to 11. So they're not vaccinated yet. It doesn't matter if the adults are vaccinated, the kids are not, and the kids can get sick and the kids can die. And we are seeing that. So please take this seriously. I know it's another COVID Halloween, but just because it's Halloween doesn't mean the virus isn't still the scariest thing. And focus on the real dangers. Those are sugar and cars. Specifically to the first one, children are going to eat a lot of sugar on Halloween. That's just going to happen. And that's part of the fun, and that's part of the joy, and that's part of the experience. Needlessly clocking your kids can be input. Obviously, don't let them eat the whole bag in one sitting. They're going to get sick. Cleaning up chocolate puke is not fun. But you can let your kids overindulge a little bit. It's okay. It's a fun event. And teaching your children that sometimes it's okay to indulge and sometimes we don't indulge is going to help set them up for a better, healthy relationship with food and their bodies and diets than if you lay down strict rules about one piece of candy, no matter what. And car-related deaths quadruple on Halloween. That is a massive increase. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Drivers are paying less attention. They might even be drunk or otherwise inebriated. Children are paying a lot less attention. They're running all over the place, excited to go to the different houses. They're usually wearing costumes that are dark and black and scary and really, really, really hard to see. So please, your children are in much more danger of being hit by a car than ingesting anything dangerous that they get from a stranger on Halloween. So teach your kids to stay on the sidewalk, remind them of those dangers rather than making them scared of Halloween. And if you want to read any more, what I'm talking about, I've written about for the Skeptical Inquirer. It's called, for my column called But What Do I Know? And thank you to Jonathan for that excellently sarcastic column title. You can just Google Ada McVean Halloween and it'll come up. But I also want to just leave you with a few photos of me through the years at Halloween. Turns out I'm actually not that great at dressing up. As I said, I guess I'm too busy every year, but these are all I could find. My favorite is definitely in the middle, the one where I'm pretending to be a Habs fan. And to pair that, this is my favorite two costumes of Joe. One is Sherlock Holmes and one of him pretending to be a Leafs fan.
Well, there is a background story to that, of course, wearing the Raptors shirt and the Leafs underwear. This was 2 years ago when we were flying and got stuck in Toronto and no luggage. So the only thing we could do was to outfit ourselves from the stores at the airport. And the only kind of shirts they had were Raptors. The Raptors, I don't mind that much. I stick up for them. But I tell you that wearing those maple leaf shorts did not have a good effect on a particular part of the anatomy.
Was it a nocebo effect, Joe?
You're right. All right. In any case, I remember, when my kids were small, of course, we took them trick-or-treating, and they would map out the houses where they knew they were getting good stuff from previous years. And we had a dentist on the street, and he gave out toothbrushes and dental floss. They didn't want to go to that house because they said that it took up too much room in the bag, that where they could have used candy. But there was another house that they rigorously avoided. And this was a guy who used to hope that when the kids said trick or treat, they would say trick because he was ready for that. And this guy would open the door dressed up as that character from the movie Halloween, that was one scary movie. And he had the mask on and holding a knife, just like a serial killer, which is what he was. So the kids wanted to, of course, stay away from that. And talking about Halloween and serial killers, off we go with Jonathan.
Indeed. Can you all see my slides?
Yes.
So is this what he looked like, Joe? Like Michael Myers?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that was the attempt,
Right.
but I just remember that they were scared enough not to want to knock on that door.
It's very wise, very wise. Yeah. So so it's Halloween, and we know it's Halloween because there is yet another sequel in the Halloween franchise. The franchise will never die; will go on forever. So of course, Halloween's about Michael Myers, who becomes a serial killer. And so I wanted to talk about not serial killers, but the people who hunt them, specifically serial killer profilers. I mean, we see this on television and in the movies all the time. There's just so many examples of this idea of people who track down serial killers, who know things about how these killers think. And I want to bring this up because there is a science component to it, as we shall see. You might be familiar with the show Mindhunter on Netflix, which is a dramatized account of the history of the development of criminal profiling in the States in the 70s and 80s. Agents in the FBI who are starting to interview serial killers who have been arrested, who are in prison, and they chat with them to try and understand their mind, to try and come up with some kind of classification of these killers. And they come up with this idea that some of them are organized, and some of them are disorganized, and that is sort of at the top of their little hierarchy. Of course, we see this with the TV show Hannibal, where we see Will Graham, who has these kinds of visions. That's something that we commonly see in the media representation of profilers, right? They walk onto the scene of the crime and they start to see visions of what the killer saw. And they start saying things like, that's not how he's loving them. He wouldn't disrespect them that way. He doesn't want these girls to suffer. He kills them quickly, and to his thinking, with mercy. I bring up Hannibal, which was a fantastic TV show, but of course, if you're older, you might remember Hannibal Lecter as being portrayed by Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs, 1991. And if you're even older than that, you may remember the first appearance of Hannibal Lecter in the movies, and that was played by Brian Cox in Manhunter, 1986, which was the first adaptation of the Red Dragon book, which is the first book in the Hannibal Lecter series. Brian Cox, who can now be seen, of course, in Succession. But in all of these movies, you see, Will Graham, or you see Clarice Starling. You see these people who, they track down these killers. They understand how they think. They interview killers like Hannibal Lecter to get an idea of how they think. So I was curious to know, like in real life, what do we know about this? This is another example from Manhunter. So we have this idea that this is how things are done in real life, and that this is a very scientific kind of process. And so I was curious to know how popular this was. And these are some figures I found in the literature. In the United Kingdom, this is back in 1995. Roughly 83% of police officers were claiming that they found criminal profiling to be operationally useful. Almost all of them reporting that they would seek the advice of a profiler again. In 2006, about 86% of forensic mental health professionals who were surveyed believe that criminal profiling is a useful law enforcement tool. So it is quite popular. It is used. My question, of course, is, does it work? And here is one claim, that I was hinting at in the little Mindhunter segment there. So this idea that you can sort offenders into those who are organized, or they plan their homicide, and they're very, very meticulous, and people who are disorganized. But the reality is that does not really appear to be true. In fact, there was a study where researchers examined 100 murders that were committed by serial killers in the United States. And they were looking at crime scene behaviors categorized as either organized or disorganized. But in contrast to what would be predicted from this categorization, the analysis actually did not reveal any distinct subsets of so-called organized and disorganized behaviors. So it doesn't seem like this is really a thing in practice. Another claim that we see made by profilers is that offenders will behave in a certain way at their crime scene the way that they do in other aspects of their life. Right? So they had this idea that if you have a suspect and you go to their house, you will see elements of their personality that you have seen at the crime scene. You'll be able to say, aha, yes, because I saw this at the place where they live, and we saw this also at the crime scene, it's a link. And psychology says, well, not really. In fact, there was a consensus that started to emerge, 50 years ago, that to simply rely on a person's personality as a primary explanation for how they behave was a serious mistake, because there are factors in the situation that you're in that contribute as much to your behavior as who you are as a person, what your personality disposition is. So again, this kind of facile explanation that doesn't really pan out in real life. And of course, a claim that we hear all the time is that these professional profilers can make very accurate predictions. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, you might as well flip a coin. There was a study where professional profilers were shown details of a solved crime or a crime series that they were not familiar with, and they were asked to make predictions about who the likely offender might be. And it was a multiple choice question, right? So they had a list of people that it could be with descriptions of who they were. They knew about the crime, and so they had to figure out who was the best fit for this. And they did do better than college students and psychologists on their overall accuracy of the profile of who did this and on physical attributes, but no better on how these killers think, on how they behave when they offend, on their social history, their habits. So it looks as if, you know, what they had working for them was a knowledge of what we call base rate information, right? So for example, if you know that most serial killers in the United States are white men in their 30s and 40s, that's a base rate information. So if you arrive at the scene of a crime, it looks like a serial killer, well, it's likely to be a white man in their 30s and 40s, because this is what is commonly seen. That knowledge seems to be more important than any kind of quote unquote knowledge that is actually gained from profiling. So interestingly enough, so it doesn't seem to be very scientific. So do we see the signs of a pseudoscience in criminal profiling? So pseudoscience meaning a fake science, something that looks like a science, but that really isn't. It's something that I find particularly interesting. So, you know, there is this spectrum of things that are scientific versus things that are pseudoscientific. They exist on the spectrum at both extremes. And it's very hard. There is no line between them. In fact, this is a common problem in the philosophy of science. It's called the demarcation problem. Where is the line between science and pseudoscience? It turns out there is no clear line. There is no clear demarcation. It really is a spectrum. There's a zone of gray in the middle. But we do have examples of things that are clearly scientific, like astronomy is very scientific. Astrology is now very much a pseudoscience. It might have started out as a bit of a proto-science, but at some point it clearly became pseudo-scientific. And this is what I really wanted to get at, is this: what are the signs of a pseudoscience? And we can see if they apply to criminal profiling. So you might think of them as red flags of you know, what should trigger this skeptical response in you of like, it sounded scientific, but now that I look at this, maybe it's not. One of the signs of a pseudoscience is that they're not fans of the peer review system and of criticism. So peer review is this very useful but incomplete and imperfect way in which, when you submit the results of a study for publication, other scientists take a look at it and they provide some anonymous feedback to make sure that what you are submitting is the best version of it that it can be, and that there aren't any glaring holes in this. This is in part how science moves forward and progresses. In the pseudosciences, you're not a big fan of the peer review system because there are very large holes in the story that you're telling, and they're not fans of criticism as a whole. Another sign of a pseudoscience is blinding with science, and we see this a lot on websites that sell you gadgets that look scientific but that don't really work. You know, healing crystals and quantum thingamajigs. There's usually a page on these websites called The Science or How It Works. And you might see links to publications, to scientific publications showing that their gadget works. Well, if you click on them, you will see that those studies that they list are usually studies about general principles in science. So for example, if they claim that their gadget works through some kind of quantum entanglement, they will post a link to a study on quantum entanglement, which is a real thing, but the study did not test the gadget in particular. So they are kind of blinding you with science by showing you studies that are very scientific, but that don't actually apply to the gadget that they're selling, to the specific claim that they are making. Another big sign of a pseudoscience is that it tends not to progress very much. It gets stale very quickly because it begins with a belief And everything has to kind of be warped around it to make sure the belief continues to exist. And so whereas science evolves and changes, and definitely saw this during COVID, as we learn more and more information and our models change, pseudosciences tend to remain fairly stale. Astrology hasn't changed very much over the past few centuries because it is a pseudoscience. Any contradictory evidence that you bring up can be explained away, right? It's never a valid criticism. It's always something that, no, well, actually, yeah, there's always a way around any kind of criticism. If there are 19 studies showing that the pseudoscience doesn't work, but one study that shows that it does, they will cherry pick that one study and hold it up and say, see, we've got a study showing that it works, and they will put the 19 studies, they will push them under the carpet. And the last, major sign of a pseudoscience that it usually lacks a plausible mechanism. When you think about what we know about biology, about chemistry, about physics, you often can't see how this thing would actually work. But they will tell you, well, we don't know how it works, but somehow it does work. So these are sort of the classic signs of a pseudoscience. And when we look at serial killer profiling, we do see a lot of these signs. We were offered a lot of anecdotes that profiling works, but very little scientific evidence. And interestingly enough, historically, profilers have not been very keen to participate in research to have their skills evaluated. So they claim that they're very good at what they do, but when researchers come in and say, well, let's test those skills, the profilers tend to say, no, thanks. And there's a lot of cherry picking of positive findings, because once in a while, it does seem to work. And those examples are held up, but all the negative predictions that they made are quickly swept under the rug. So, to be generous, serial killer profiling is not scientific at the moment. It could be a proto-science. It could be in its infancy, and maybe there are things, there are reproducible bits of knowledge there that could eventually, help form something that is very rigorous and scientific. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to work very well.
And we will now segue to classic type of serial killer, of course, the vampire. What better time to discuss this than Halloween? The image that we have of the vampire, pale face, the protruding teeth, dressed sort of elegantly. Why do we have this image? It essentially comes from Bela Lugosi, who, of course, was the prototype for the film Vampire. He was a Hungarian actor, of course, very appropriate, because the Dracula story supposedly takes place in Transylvania. He passed away in 1956, a notable date, because that was the date of the Hungarian Revolution. That's when I left Hungary, and that's when he left the world. The movie Dracula is really an excellent movie given the time at which it was made. Of course, there were no dramatic special effects, but it is surprisingly well acted. Now, Lugosi, I think, is the most famous of all the film Draculas, but certainly not the only one. Christopher Lee did a very good job portraying Dracula. And I also saw Frank Langella play the Count on Broadway. And he had kind of a different take on it. Wasn't quite as frightening as Lugosi. He was more of an elegant gentleman. And then there was what was supposed to be the definitive version, starring Gary Oldman, looking like a very, very bizarre Dracula. I didn't care much for that movie at all. The very first movie representation of Dracula was back in 1922, actually, Nosferatu, done in Germany. And again, considering that this was done in 1922, it was, of course, a silent film, it really was quite frightening. And the story was, the usual Dracula story of coming alive at night and looking for blood to suck from good-looking young women. Now, all of these portrayals generally reflect the original story by Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897. And he placed his character in Transylvania before he came to emigrated to England to wreak more havoc. Interestingly enough, Bram Stoker had never been to Transylvania, so all of his descriptions of the countryside were, from stories that he had heard or from his imagination. But he did actually have a historical character in mind on whom the story was based. And that was a ruler in Romania, Vlad Tepes, in the 15th century, who was a terrible man. And he was referred to as Vlad Dracul. Dracul in Romanian means the devil. And obviously, Dracula comes from Dracul. And he also had a nickname. He was known as Vlad the Impaler, because he would impale his enemies on sticks. And he would line the roads with these to ward off any new-coming enemies. And I would think that that was a pretty good sign that you did not want to deal with Vlad Tepes. And interesting enough, you know that the way to really do away with a vampire is to drive a wooden stake through the vampire's heart. And that probably comes from the Vlad Tepes story. In Romania, they capitalize on the Dracula story, and you can actually go for a Dracula tour. I haven't done that. I wish I could. If we ever get back to traveling again, I think I'd like to do that. They take you on a visit to what they call Dracula's castle, although there is no historical evidence that Dracula ever lived there. So, Jonathan, this would be on the scale towards the pseudo-science.
Pseudo-history, Joe.
Pseudo-history. But you can certainly go and dine at Dracula's restaurant, and there you can have traditional Transylvanian food, and you can finish off your visit by buying the usual souvenirs. You can buy mugs and cups and necklaces and all kinds of things. And if you're lucky enough, you may even meet the man himself. Now, the interesting aspect of the story is that the vampire legend actually predates Bram Stoker's Dracula. It goes back to certainly the Middle Ages. And of course, humans were plagued with all kinds of plagues back then. Disease was rampant. And very often, disease was blamed on supernatural sources. Witches supposedly caused disease. If you did something bad, the gods would get back at you by making you sick. And it was widely believed that there were creatures of the night who were responsible for some of these illnesses, because it was, important to find a source. They didn't know anything about bacteria. They didn't know anything about viruses. They didn't know what caused disease. So they looked for all kinds of explanations. And one explanation was that people who had died of some horrific disease would come back and haunt the people who were still alive. They would rise from the grave. And this really was the beginning of the vampire legend, because there were certain diseases that were linked with vampirism. The classic one is rabies. Why? Because when someone gets stricken by rabies, and those days you would die from it, this was prior to Pasteur's rabies vaccine discovery, of course, they become very photosensitive, so they fear the light. They want to stay away from water, because whenever you drink something, it causes the throat to go into very painful spasms. They have altered sleep patterns. They don't sleep at night. And of course, we know that rabies is spread through bites. So someone who died of rabies and had these kind of symptoms, this would be memorable to those who were left behind. And they thought that, after these people had passed away, they could come back and pass on the disease. Now, rabies, of course, is passed by bites. And very often bats are a problem because they can be rabid. So we see, of course, the connection with the bat. Scientifically, is there a possible explanation for why people will have some symptoms that others interpret as being signs of vampirism? There's a disease called porphyria. a very interesting disease, and is a disease of heme formation. Heme, of course, is the molecule inside red blood cells that binds iron, which in turn binds oxygen. And if the heme doesn't get properly manufactured in the body, you suffer from anemia. Well, there are diseases, porphyria is a set of diseases, in which the molecule heme does not get properly incorporated into hemoglobin. So it floats around the body, basically wreaking havoc. And because hemoglobin is not properly formed, you suffer from chronic anemia. And as we know, vampires tend to be very, very pale. And that, of course, is one of the signs of anemia. And these porphyrins that do not get incorporated into hemoglobin can deposit in bone, and they can even deposit in the teeth. So the teeth can look blood red, as if someone had been biting into an artery and sucked out blood. Pretty interesting. And of course, because of the fear of light and sunlight, people who suffer from this kind of porphyria do not want to go out into the sun. And the garlic connection is also an interesting one, because it turns out that garlic induces an enzyme called heme oxygenase that degrades hemoglobin. So of course, this would make the anemia even worse. And the garlic probably works. I think those of you who keep garlic in the house, I think will testify that you've not been visited by a vampire. So it does work. Another disease that has been linked with vampirism is pellagra. Of course, the disease of the 4Ds, dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death, it's a niacin, a B vitamin deficiency. But look at the interesting symptoms. Again, there's photosensitivity. Going out into the sunlight causes this terrible deterioration of the skin. Actually makes it look bloody. It's a terrible thing. And it also turns out that people who suffer from this niacin deficiency or from pellagra also have this strange manifestation on their tongue, erythematous glossitis, this reddening of the tongue. And it looks like they may have been sucking blood. So there are these interesting scientific and pseudoscientific connections to the story of vampires. And of course, the major question is, are there vampires today? I would submit to you that there actually are. These are the people who try to suck science out of our blood and convert it into pseudoscience. And there are many of these science-sucking vampires. And my pet character in this context is Joe Mercola, who I think is an absolute promoter of pseudoscience. He falls into every quack category that one can define. So yeah, we do have these kind of vampires, but we don't go out and threaten to drive a stake through their heart. Our weaponry is science, peer-reviewed science, and we can confront them, showing them what science actually says, and distinguish science from pseudoscience. So that's our Halloween story for today. And as we get ready to celebrate Halloween, this is what I'm going to put outside of my door. And Ada, you can come by and you can have little bits of, I think that's a nose.
You're promoting cannibalism is what you're saying.
Yeah, or ears.
You know I'm a vegetarian.
I think sugar is vegetarian. You'll be fine.
Feet. You can have feet. And
Delicious.
Unfortunately, I looked through these, there were no heads. All right, so that is our Halloween special. Go out, make sure you're safe, and enjoy this rather interesting holiday. And we will see you again in 2 weeks' time. Bye, everyone.